Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on growing food and drink exports, focusing on documentation and labelling requirements. The UK's food and drink industry is highly regarded around the world, with Brand Britain, but post-regulatory Brexit complexity and global supply chain crises has seen exports stall in recent years, particularly to Europe. And it's never a bad time to talk about this, but in light of the recent UK-EU summit, with a promised deal on sanitary and phytosanitary goods, there's never a better time to talk about boosting food and drink exports. Even with any deal, documentation is likely to remain a major part of boosting your trade with Europe. And today we have on hand with us one of the Chartered Institute's experts in Joe Goldsworthy. Joe, welcome. How are you today?
Hello, very good, thanks. Very keeping well in what has been quite a momentous week so far.
It's been a busy week for us all at the Chartered Institute. And we also had today, with us today Leanne Parkin, Operations Director at Ramsden International, and Andrew Martin, Customs Key Account Manager for DFDS Logistics. Welcome to you both. How are you today?
Hello. Good, really good. Really good week.
Afternoon, thank you. The sun's shining, so no one can complain when the sun's shining.
Brilliant. We'll hear from Andrew and Leanne later. They'll be joining us for the Q&A section towards the end of the presentation. The majority of the work today is being done by Joe, but just to introduce myself as your host, my name is Phil Abnett, and I'm a Senior Content Editor here at the Chartered Institute. However, on the next slide, before we give over to Joe, we have the first of our polls. Which markets do you predominantly export to? So there are multiple selections here. Feel free to pick all as needed: Europe, North America, South America, Africa, or Asia. We have a Q&A section, so please do send your questions in via the Q&A section here. We do endeavour to look at all of your questions. However, we do have a limited time, and this is a free webinar, so we do ask you to keep your questions as short and concise as possible. We also ask you to keep your questions as general and not too company or sector specific. It just gives us the best chance to answer as many questions as possible and not get too into the details with your particular company, and make sure that everyone else gets a chance to sort of gain from the expertise we have on offer today. We'll also send out a copy of the slides, and a recording will be available, so do check your emails afterwards. If you haven't heard from us in a couple of days, feel free to drop us a line and we'll see what we can do. Okay, about half you voted. I'll give another few seconds for everyone to vote. Thank you to everyone who has voted. We do use this information in our consideration for future webinars, so it is highly valuable. So another 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm just closing it now. Thank you to everyone who voted. That's most of you. Just sharing the results to you now. So Joe, possibly unsurprisingly, everyone who voted says they traded Europe. About 20% say North America, 7% say South America, and 13% each say Africa and Asia. Is that surprising to you? Is that sort of what you'd expect?
It's sort of what I'd expect. Obviously, with Europe being our key trading partner, that was always going to be very high. Glad to see it's actually at 100%. I was contemplating whether they were going to be like 80 to 90%. Maybe a few people had shied away from exporting to Europe, but it's good to see that everyone's stuck at it. And yeah, as for some of the other markets, well, I mean, there's huge potential in South America, Africa, Asia, and hopefully the people will have the confidence to reach out to those markets, especially with the CPTPP and other incoming trade deals.
Thank you very much for that insight. On the next slide, before we hand over to Joe, just a quick mention of our Lunchtime Learning series. So Lunchtime Learning is our dedicated member-only webinar series, and is tailored to the needs of businesses. To find out more, it covers a whole host of different topics, including digital product passports, export controls and sanctions, and how to keep your exports compliant. And as a key part of our memberships package, you should be getting a link in the chat. If you want to find out more, do consider signing up for membership, where you'll get access to this always useful resource. But that's enough from me. I'd like to hand over to Joe for the first section of the presentation. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Phil. Right, well, welcome everyone. We will go through export paperwork over the next few slides. Next slide, please. So exporting food and drinks overseas can sometimes seem like rather a formidable, daunting process, but the rewards can be transformative for a business, not only increasing revenue, but also cementing themselves as a popular brand in another market can immensely prove the reputation of a company. From a UK export perspective, there are not many requirements for certification at the UK border. However, upon import, there are usually numerous requirements which need to be adhered to before goods leave the UK border. Whether this be health certification, proof on origin, or registration, failure to comply with these requirements can often lead to lengthy delays at the border. It used to be very difficult to uncover exactly what was required in terms of paperwork for destination countries, but actually in recent years, there's been strident progress made by HMRC on the online tariff, by Department of Business and Trade with their doing business guides, and independent organisations such as ourselves, International Trade Centre and Chambers of Commerce, all able to provide advice on exactly what is needed, what tools you need to monitor, what requirements might be in place for the products you export. Next slide, please. The commercial invoice is one of the key documents when you're exporting goods, as this will include most of the information necessary to clear customs, such as the example here. We should have full contact and address details. Sorry, example, please. Thank you. Full contact details and address of the seller and buyer, and a IORI number of the exporter, as well as the registration number of the importer. The description of goods is quite a funny one because it should always include commodity codes. For export, this should be 8 digits, and this should be from the UK online tariff. Occasionally, you'll get importers from other countries requesting them to change it to their tariff, which should not be the case. It should always be the the 8-digit commodity code as per the UK online tariff. Also, with commercial invoices, it's really important to make sure that the description of the goods is in plain text English. It should describe what the good actually is, rather than include acronyms or brand names. Also necessary, we need the quantity of goods. Country of origin of the goods is super important, as we'll see in the next couple of slides, as well as the gross and net weight. Price of goods, currency, and it's crucial to have Incoterms on the commercial invoice. We do still see that many invoices lack Incoterms. For food and drink, I would also say that it is crucial to have a packing list, especially as those will usually contain best before information and batch numbers, which are crucial to the food and drink industry. Next slide, please. So another thing which is often included in an invoice is a preference statement. It can be on a commercial invoice or it could be a standalone document, but it's a crucial piece in the export jigsaw, as this allows importers to potentially qualify for lower or negated rates of duty, depending on the trade deal in place with the UK and the recipient country. Most free trade agreements allow for a statement of origin, which is a prescribed body of text, which allows the importer to then claim preference. This preference statement is used for any goods which can qualify for lower rate or negated rate of duty. So it's important that the exporter checks what origin requirements are in place for the food or drink they export, as this can change from product to product. Some agreements, rather than using a statement of origin, will request either an EUR1 statement, a certification of origin in the case of the CPTPP, or a declaration of origin for some countries such as Australia. Preparation is fundamental for this. If you're unsure, then you really should seek advice on how to claim preference with the recipient country. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we've got the prescribed body of text which you'd find on a statement of origin. This statement is used by the importer to get lower rates of duty. Trade with the EU alongside several other trading partners such as Canada, Japan, Turkey, they all permit the use of an EORI number as the exporter reference number. However, this is not the case in all trade deals. Other countries which accept a statement of origin may need an approved exporter number to claim preference. This number is obtained upon application from HMRC and is a real gateway to exploring new markets, as it can cut significant paperwork costs instead of applying for EUR1 statements for every consignment. Next slide, please. But before issuing a statement of origin or an EUR1 statement, it is crucial that you do the work to make sure that your products actually are applicable for preferential rates of duty. So before claiming preference, it's strongly advised that companies review whether or not their food or drink products meet the origin criteria for the destination country. Simply producing a product may not be enough. So inputs need to be considered before applying this preference and this preferential statement. In some scenarios where there are 2 or more different free trade agreements available, exporters can actually adapt this to their benefit. For example, a sugar syrup, which you'd find in, say, a coffee shop and added to coffees, may not have previously qualified for preference under the UK-Japan Comprehensive Partnership Agreement. However, with accession to the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, these products now qualify because of the changes in rules of origin. Once products have been identified as qualifying for preference, another important step is to ensure a supplier's declaration is supplied to the importer ahead of time. So this should always be done before exporting your goods. Here on the slide, we've got the prescribed text which you would use for a supplier's declaration. However, one thing we would note is that this is the basic wording. And if there are complex rules of origin, then you might need to detail how your product actually meets those rules of origin. And the benefit of having a supplier's declaration is that this will answer any queries should customs have an inquiry about why someone has claimed preference. We are seeing it more and more often that customs are actually looking into how preference has been applied for certain products. So it is crucial to make sure you have your supplier's declarations in hand and ready. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Joe. Just dropping real quickly to ask the second of our poll questions. What is the greatest challenge you face when exporting food and drink to new markets? So just as a reminder, we do have a Q&A section in a second. Thank you for everyone who has submitted their questions. If you could drop in your questions in the Q&A section, we can make sure they're answered. Just a reminder, if you keep them as general and brief as possible, it just helps me out with reading them and means that I'm more able to make sure they apply to a wider audience. So the options for you in the poll are export paperwork, labeling, border checks, logistics, and other. If you have other, there is also a chat function. Do just drop us a message. It just helps us to understand more about you, really. Again, most of you voted. We're just waiting for the last few. I'll let the poll run for another few seconds before I close it and share the results. So closing it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, about 64% say export paperwork is their biggest challenge. 14% saying labeling and border checks each. And then there is one more that says other. I'm sure we'll get an answer in a second. Joe, 64% say export paperwork is their biggest sort of threat. Is that surprising to you?
To be brutally honest, no, it's not all that surprising, especially given the first poll said 100% of attendees exported to Europe. I think the biggest challenge in recent times has been export paperwork to make sure that everything is okay. The one surprise I would say is I would have thought there'd be a slightly higher score on labeling, but if everyone's getting their labeling right, then that's fantastic.
We can certainly hope that's the case. All right, before I hand back up to Joe, on the next slide, you'll see more about our member helpline. So to keep your trade moving while staying compliant with the support of our world-renowned experts, the International Trade Technical Helpline equips our business members with a direct line to our trade and customs specialists. We should be dropping a link in the chat now, but it is just another benefit of membership in the Chartered Institute. Thank you for everyone who answered the questions. Joe, back over to you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So on to SPS controls, and well, SPS controls stand for sanitary and phytosanitary controls, which have definitely hit the headlines this week with the announcement that there will be a common SPS area which will be introduced as part of the UK-EU summit. Now, the full framework of this is yet to be announced, although we have some details which we'll announce towards the end. Obviously, this is going to be discussed at length with both parties over the coming months, so it won't be a very quick turnaround, but many exporting businesses up and down the land will be glad to see that there has been an agreement on SPS controls, and many businesses are hopeful that this will be in place sometime in 2026. Now, SPS controls are not just a thing between the UK and the EU, as SPS rules apply worldwide, and it applies to a great deal of product, both of animal and plant origin, sanitary being animal and phytosanitary being plant. Both of those could be potentially hazardous either to human health or indeed to plant and animal health or biosecurity for the country. There is a framework for SPS rules worldwide called the SPS Agreement, which all countries have to adhere to. And then they use scientific reasoning to perhaps strengthen that according to their own country's needs. So some may be slightly more lax, whereas some countries may have quite stringent SPS policies, again, such as Australasia, for example. Now, by having these SPS controls in place, it can prevent the transmission of dangerous pests, diseases, and contaminants to the ecosystem of the recipient country. Sanitary controls don't just cover meat and dairy, but also stuff like animal byproducts, such as wool and leather. Similarly, phytosanitary controls also cover timber and even used agricultural machinery, so not just fruit and vegetables. Next slide, please. So this slide goes into a little bit more detail about what to expect when exporting to Europe. Now, obviously, this will change in the coming months or years. It's going to be a slow process. So for the meantime, this is what we still have to adhere to. But also, this is a very similar process when exporting outside of Europe, because again, many of these countries will have SPS controls in place. So whilst it may not seem pertinent if you're not planning to export to the EU until the SPS agreement comes into effect, the framework is still very similar where SPS rules are applied in other countries. First, what would happen is the importer or person responsible for the load must send a pre-notification. Now, for the EU, they use a system called Traces. If it's an importer in the UK, it would be IPAFFS. However, dependent on the country you're exporting to, they may have a different system in place. This pre-notification is always in place to advise that an SPS consignment will be arriving at a designated port within the destination country. In some scenarios, the exporter will also need to register as an approved exporter prior to the consignment being dispatched. So it's important to make sure you do the legwork on your side as well. Then the correct export health certificate for sanitary goods or phytosanitary certificate for plant and plant products must be raised to cover the products on a consignment. Now that certificate will then need to be signed by a certifying official. Dependent on the goods being sent, either a documentary, physical, or identity check will then take place in the port of landing. Now, obviously, it depends. If it's live animals, then it's almost certainly going to be a physical check. However, if it's a low-risk good, it may be subject to just a documentary check. So you do need to liaise with the importer if you're doing business to business, or do your research if you're going straight to market, as the requirements and risk factors will change dependent on the country you're going to. Next slide, please. However, in some cases, an export health certificate may not be necessary. This could be because there is no model health certificate available, or because the prerequisites for the country of import are just different. In these scenarios, a company should try and obtain the correct wording needed for a health certificate if it needs to be certified by a local council rather than one of the export health certificates available on gov.uk. because that will be necessary for entry into that particular country. The wording does change dependent from country to country. So if you do not have clear advice from your importer, again, it's suggested that you reach out to another organisation to get that to hand. Of course, there are other documentation which is available for food and drink products. It could be a certificate of resale, usually used for some countries such as Jordan, such as some of the Northern African countries as well. And those are used for processed foods quite often, as well as drinks. CITES certificates for protected flora and fauna, organic certification, again, thankfully, that looks to have been eroded with the announcements of the UK-EU summit. However, organic certificates are still required for the meantime. If you deal with fish, then it could be a catch certificate you will need. And if you're entering into any Middle Eastern countries, you may want to look into halal certification as well. Finally, I would say that it's important to research your product against what the controls are for that market, as there are waivers available. Certain processed foods, for example, might count as being a composite food product. And for those, you won't need to go the extra mile with health certification, because actually they meet the processing requirements that it's considered a composite food, and a waiver can be applied, meaning that it's allowed easier access into the country. Next slide, please. Now, we've covered export certification to some degree. Obviously, I can't do a really deep dive into it with the allotted time, but we're just going to have a look at food labelling now, because especially for outside of the EU, this can be sometimes quite tricky and troublesome for first-time exporters. And next slide, please. So a crucial part of any food business, whether exporting or just for the internal market, is ensuring that food labelling has been done correctly, as the consequences with errors can be really severe. While some countries can deviate away from labelling requirements enforced in the UK, many countries have actually tried to adopt a very similar framework in recent years. The core requirements for a label on a food or drink product usually include A, the name of the product, B, the registered address, as well as the country of origin. Now, the country of origin might not be needed in all cases, but if you've got packaging where it might be misleading where the country of production is, or for certain foodstuffs such as meat and dairy, then a country of origin is necessary. Then you need the net weight of the product and a list of ingredients by weight. Now, with the UK and the EU, you've got to highlight up to 14 different allergens dependent on the ingredients being used. However, that criteria does change dependent on the country. For example, access to Malaysia or Vietnam, you only have to list 10 allergens, whereas with Australia and New Zealand, you have to list 23 allergens. So again, it's important to double check what the food labelling requirements are for that destination country, as they do sometimes change. Last but not least, you do need either a use by or best before, nutritional information, as well as storage and cooking instructions. Any beverages above 1.2% ABV will need to include the ABV of the product on the label. And for exports to the EU of alcohol products, from 2026, you need to make sure that the health risks for consuming alcohol are actually on that label as well. Otherwise, they could be refused entry from next year. Next slide, please. One of the common pitfalls for first-time exporters is that those who are looking to expand into new markets need to display a registered address on the label. Now, the address included on the label needs to be used for all official documentation for that country. So this is okay if you're just doing internal sales in the UK. However, when you are reaching out to new markets, you have got to have a registered address either for that recipient country or that customs union. So where the sale of the goods is to another distributor, that is fine, because usually the address will be the name of the distributor established in that country. However, operators need to be wary of using an Incoterm called DDP. Or if they're doing business to consumer or direct to consumer sales. Now, this is because they themselves would need to establish a registered address in the destination country. Now, obviously, this is no mean feat. So you've got to make sure that you've got a registered office or somewhere similar that can act as your first point of correspondence for that country. Now, of course, this is why many businesses favor to use business-to-business models, especially when they're exporting for the first time. But it's something to be mindful of when you're going into new markets. Next slide, please. Now, it is very difficult to fit all of this information on one label in multiple languages. So very often, food and drink products need to be relabeled for each destination. The fact is, these labels will need to be in the local language of that destination country. And so therefore, it's important to consider the costs for the translation, along with the material and labeling costs for these products. They need to be factored in when you're reaching out to new markets. Not factoring this in, it can occasionally happen where sales reach out to a new market and they've not factored this in, and it can wipe out margin when exporting to a new region or country. So, next slide, please. Finally, I just wanted to touch on a couple of free trade agreements, new or in the pipeline, as this is some of the biggest movement we're finding at the moment in food and drink markets. The fact is, it's been a pretty busy month with the UK securing deals with Europe, a renewed EU-UK summit. You've got your new UK-India free trade agreement, further agreements with America, talks with Turkey. So there's a lot going on. Next slide, please. First, I wanted to touch on the CPTPP. So this is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is rather a mouthful. Even the acronym is a bit of a mouthful, to be honest. But it's a huge growing market with increasing demand for diverse food products. Meat, seafood, dairy products, and confectionery have all done well when reaching out to some of the Southeast Asian countries within the CPTPP, such as Vietnam, and new markets which we've not previously had trade deals with, such as Malaysia and Brunei. So we are finding that food exporters, they're following similar requirements to those elsewhere, and they're able to win new trade in Southeast Asia. But there is also leverage on the rules of origin for CPTPP. So especially for access to Vietnam and to Japan, there are lightened rules of origin, which means it's easier for your products to qualify for preferential duty, making it that much more attractive to certain countries within the agreement. Next slide. So in the flurry of news in the UK this month, the UK has reached an agreement with India to sign a new free trade agreement with the country. Whilst the final text of the free trade agreement is yet to be completed, there have already been announcements of some pretty humongous tariff reductions which will be introduced, including huge reductions for whiskies and gin, which will see a massive boost for the UK spirits industry, but also several food products such as confectionery and meat such as lamb and salmon all get lower rates of duty and could see boosted sales in the region. But what I wanted to highlight from this agreement was not the tariff so much as the facilitation of trade which has been promised within the agreement. Historically, India has been rather a tricky area to export to. Sometimes the rules on clearance are unclear and labelling requirements have been a bit muddy. However, the proposed free trade agreement has really paid attention to this. So the FTA has been seeking to address these issues and has laid down really clear rules on customs clearance, rules of origin, the SPS controls when entering India, and technical barriers to trade, meaning that actually UK exporters should find it that little bit easier when reaching out to that market going forward. Now, obviously, this is not fully ratified yet, but in a few months' time, we're hoping that it becomes that much more significantly easier. Next slide, please. And finally, it would be remiss of me not to close off with Europe. Still the biggest trading partner with the UK, exports to Europe have stagnated in recent years. At the end of the day, exports of some fruit products were down 35% from pre-Brexit times. However, with the announcement on Monday of a common SPS area, there's really renewed impetus to reach out to the region, establish contact with lapsed customers or indeed new customers. So it's a really good time to try and cement yourself in that region once again. What we do know of what will become the UK-EU sanitary and phytosanitary zone is that export health certificates will eventually be removed. Now, this could mean businesses could save up to £200 per consignment, which is quite a huge reduction in the level of costs for export paperwork. There's also the removal of plant health certificates being proposed, as well as the removal for the certificates of inspection for organic products. So there's a lot of costs, but also time involved within that certification, which could be removed. And we're aware of many UK businesses which dropped organic certification for their products just because they found clearance for those goods particularly difficult. So it could be that you could be looking to reinstate your organic certification for those products. Furthermore, routine border checks on agri-foods would essentially stop. That is what is being proposed. So goods such as dairy, fish, eggs, red meat, which were subject to 100% paperwork checks and up to 30% physical checks, those will be removed. So it allows for perhaps a greater, more fluid movement in and out of the EU, because this will be reciprocal in the UK as well. So what I would close off by saying is that while it is fantastic news, ultimately this has not come into force yet. When it does, it will be a huge burden lifted for exporters which are looking to reach out to the EU again. But now is the time to start looking at export. Now is the time to start testing the market, because you don't want to be left behind in the dust compared to some of your competitors who may already be reaching out to those markets. Okay, Phil.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. So we're just going to launch the final of our polls. So this is to understand a bit more about you. Is your company actively trying to expand the list of countries they export to this year? Yes, no, or unsure. So a couple of questions come in. I think Joe might touch on a bit more of the EU-UK Food and Drink Summit when we put the question to him in a second. Yeah, was already getting a few votes in. Thank you very much. For those that are still wavering on whether to answer or not, we do use this information to filter into sort of our policy considerations and what we pick for webinar suggestions. There is a post-webinar survey, which we do appreciate your feedback on, where you can rate us or drop us any suggestions. Yeah, feel free to be as honest as you can. We do greatly value your feedback and use it to shape the future of our webinar program. So regardless of what happens, I hope you found this entire session useful. Most people responded. Final reminder to drop any questions you might have in the Q&A function below. We've got a few already, and we look forward to getting to it in a second. So closing the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, Joe, possibly not that surprising. About 50% say they are actively trying to expand the list of countries they export to. Only 13% say no, and 38% say unsure. Is this sort of what you've seen with the consultancies you've been involved in?
Yeah, I'd say that's a relatively fair outlook on the UK exporting sector at the moment, to be honest. I'd say it's possibly fair to say that food and drink has had a little bit of a hard time over the last few years. But I think with light on the horizon, now is the time to reach out to those markets and try and expand that portfolio.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for answering these questions. I'm just going to return now. So at this point, I'd like to welcome back Leanne and Andrew to the webinar. So just a reminder, Leanne Parkin is Operations Director at Ramsden International, and Andrew Martin is a Customs Key Account Manager for DFDS Logistics. Welcome back, everyone. So the first question we have, thank you for everyone who submitted them, is from Joe. How would you suggest companies prepare themselves when exporting to a new location for the first time? Leanne, could you answer that one? Then I'll bring in everyone else in a second.
Yeah, so it's not an interesting answer, but read as much as you can. There's so much information out there. The great.gov website's really useful, particularly if it's a brand new market that you're going into, and we tap into the DBT quite a lot. Once you've read, make sure you understand the timelines. So we've got an example at the minute where we're trying to ship goods into Iraq for the first time. Brand new market, customers got a store launch in a month. They want the goods there in a month, but when we've looked further into the compliance, it needs certificates of conformity. We need to speak to the Iraqi consulate to get our commercial invoice and things validated. So that 4-week store launch is going to have to get pushed out, which isn't ideal from a customer perspective, but just make sure you understand your timelines, because there's nothing worse than going back to a customer and explaining that you can't do it. And if you've got freight forwarders that you already use, reach out to them as well, because areas like Iraq don't feel like you're going to commonly go to them, but actually there's companies out there that will. And if you can speak to agents in territory, you'll get a much greater understanding of what you need to do. But yeah, I'm afraid it is reading, a lot of reading.
Andrew?
I'd highlight the exact same points, to be completely honest. As Joseph alluded to earlier, the sort of online help from the likes of HMRC has vastly improved over recent times, certainly from the start of Brexit, where it was very minimal to what you get now. So the information is out there, although sometimes it does look a bit daunting. And again, as Leanne said there, engaging with the right parties at the very, very start of even considering movements before you even plan to move anything. Although it seems like a drawn-out process, which it is, and it seems like an unnecessary step to some stakeholders, not everybody within the movement is fully understanding of everything there. And is a huge potential to cause unnecessary additional demurrage and transport costs, and in the case of rejection, sometimes results in the worst case scenario of goods being destroyed. Example of this very recently, actually, we had a food manufacturer who have been exporting into the EU since post-Brexit times, very successfully, and have very recently decided to move a new line of business trading with South Africa. Ultimately, when they set this up, kind of had the thought of this can't be too different in trading with the EU. And as the goods left GB, there was sort of no major issues, because exports are exports. It's a very, very broad thing to say, but they are. Although upon arrival, they were missing key origin documentation that was needed to be provided by their local Chamber of Commerce, which of course is one of the key differences with trading with South Africa. And as we managed to resolve this very luckily, as we'd said, there caused a good few days extra delays, which ultimately cost the supply or cost the manufacturer, and really ate into their margins at that point. So just read and do your research beforehand.
Thank you both. Just a reminder, Export.org has the daily update, which is a regular newsletter on international trade, and we regularly have pieces on things like Trade Insights and Trade Explained on sometimes quite technical trade and customs topics. But Joe, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, those are two of the more challenging areas, shall we say, in Iraq and South Africa. But it does highlight how important it is to understand what requirements are there. And like you've said, there's been strident work in the last few years to improve HMRC's offering in terms of what requirements are out there for each individual market. Rest assured, to those who are looking to export on the call, not all of them are as difficult as Iraq and South Africa. Those are two of the more challenging markets, but the clearance can change from country to country, so it's always good to be prepared.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone, for your answers. Iraq and South Africa as major exporting areas are completely unaware, to be honest. So we have another question in. Are there any underutilized FTAs, so free trade agreements, for exporters to consider? Leanne, I'll pass this one to you.
Yeah, I think a good example for us is Australia, the Australia-New Zealand one. There's zero tariffs on loads of products. You've not got a lot of the language barriers that you get going into other markets, so it's a lot easier to talk to people. You kind of speak in the same language. But what I would say, you've got to understand your origin of your products. Like it is absolutely critical that you understand the origin. For a company like ours that export in excess of 300 commodity codes per load we're sending out, understanding the origin, making sure we've got the right paperwork with it. Because what I would say about the Australian border in particular is once they've stopped you, they will stop you repeatedly if they find anything wrong with that first load of paperwork until they're happy that you're doing the right thing. But yeah, that market's really interesting because there's a lot of cultural similarities between the UK and Australia, particularly from a food and drink perspective. So yeah, that's definitely one to look at, but please just make sure you understand the paperwork. This is from experience.
So Australian customers, if they stop you once, they really want to make sure you've nailed it the second time.
Yeah, and third time and fourth time, and however more times they want to do it. But it's really important because they are hot on their paperwork.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Leanne. I hope that answers your question. I'm going to float this one to Andrew. Any practical tips and markets where clearance is an issue? Andrew, for you?
I think for this one, consider using all routes available to you. It's not sort of worming your way around looking for the easiest route. The paperwork isn't important because it is, of course, important everywhere. I think a prime example of this, bringing it back to trading with Europe. Right at the start of Brexit, many people may be aware of the issues when shipping into the EU via Rotterdam, with constant delays and still everybody sort of learning what they're doing at the time. And at the time we found it, and actually even though Rotterdam has got vastly better, sometimes vastly quicker to ship using the short straits via France to move products of animal origin. And although sort of it may add additional trucking time and trucking miles onto a journey, the relatively short hold through a well-practiced CVEP in France can quite often make up for this. And it's the kind of same thoughts of, you know, checking your shipping routes and bits when you're moving sort of into wider markets, but certainly it leads back to your kind of research points and going back to there, but sort of using all shipping routes available is a key tip there.
Thank you, Andrew. Another question, which I'll throw up to the entire floor. Any way to streamline exports to the EU? Leanne, if you want to start off, then I'll come to you, Andrew, and then you, Joe.
Yes, this new trade agreement would be great. But in real life, what we found at the start was get a partner that you can work with on the other side that's going to walk you through what you need to do. We spent a lot of time just after Brexit in France. We spent a lot of time in Dunkirk, in Calais, working with the FDS, working with the CVEP, understanding what they wanted from us in terms of how you package your goods. So we provide truck maps now to the CVEP so they can instantly get to the SPS controls. We put sample boxes of the products on top, and we've got a relationship now with particularly the CVEP in Dunkirk. So they've got direct contact into our compliance team. So if they ever notice anything wrong with the paperwork, they've got instant access to us. But again, it's partnership. It's making sure you've got a partner that you can work with and that you both bought into the same thing and can put you in touch with the right people, because it is complicated. The SPS controls are complex, but once you understand them and you kind of get your paperwork templates together, it is so much easier. And it's so much easier kind of going through it with a partner that's feeling the struggle and will stick by you as well when things go wrong, because it does.
Andrew.
I think building on Leanne's earlier point of understanding your products, even when you're exporting to a similar location but with new goods or shipping goods you haven't shipped for some time, it's important to always carry on doing your homework and not just assuming because you've shipped it once it will be in one way, it will be the same again. Export health certificates and sometimes plant numbers of suppliers change with minimal notice. And if you've got your good vet in the UK, they usually bang on it as well. Although certainly starting that process with knowing what you're meant to provide is extremely helpful. So it's important to regularly check those documents that you're completing and make sure you're completing the right ones to avoid issues at the borders. In all cases, sort of knowing your products and making sure all your necessary paperwork, even if it sometimes seems unnecessary, is attached to the documentary packs. It is more often than, well, no, far too often you see in or we're seeing loads rejected in the EU because of missing details. And I'm very rarely, or even yet to see any goods being rejected because of too much paperwork being provided. As Leanne said, she's gone, you know, they've gone through a huge process of adding extra samples, putting things in additional places that whilst on paper aren't necessary, is a huge benefit, because CVET, the vets in Calais, Dunkirk, and even in Rotterdam, they want to work with you. They want an easy life. Because ultimately they want the goods into their country, but need a little bit of help, especially when you're moving a huge amount of commodities at once.
Thank you, Andrew. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to touch on the 2 points you've already raised, to be honest, because it used to be that you were able to use a variety of different hauliers. This is no longer really the case, and you need a trusted partner by your side who you know is going to move your goods from A to B, who knows how to reroute trucks dependent on traffic flow, so that they can observe when it's best to go short straights or best to go Rotterdam. They will help you with the clearance on paperwork as well. And there is no such thing as an oversupply of documentation. So at the end of the day, the more prepared you are, the better. So this is commercial invoice, it is export health certificates, it is suppliers declarations, it's which is a bit of an unwritten rule, but making sure that you have these suppliers declarations in hand if you've got any rules of origin query, and that's available for all countries, not just Australia, but we know that it's happening in Europe quite a lot at the moment. But even product specs, it can answer those queries which customs may have, and it can be your ticket to a quicker customs clearance at the end of the day.
Thank you, everyone. Just one question before I move back to some of the questions we've got in from the floor. Leanne, Andrew, so you've talked a lot about partnership. Do you have any quick tips to people on sort of finding and evaluating partners out there that they can do business with?
I think for me, it's finding a partner that understands your products. So we export food, we export drinks. We had an instance not too long ago that was awful, where a customer had decided to go FCA, shipped with a haulier that had never done food before, so didn't have anything set up once it hit the French border, but then were refusing to move off the French border because they were adamant that what they were doing the right thing. Now, as their supplier, they were shipping FCA, we'd provided everything they needed, but they'd not done the relevant paperwork, but then we stepped in to support with that. So make sure whoever you're picking to partner understands the product that you're exporting, because having someone for us that understands food is critical, because the controls are so different. They aren't, if I was exporting plain tyres, for example. So that's really important. As a business, we always pick people that we can partner with, so people that share a similar view of the world, understand what we're trying to achieve, understand our growth, and people that you can have conversations with. So we worked with DFDS in Bruges for a really long time to get our entity and everything set up in the EU, and that partnership's continued through. So yeah, I think it's definitely finding someone that understands the product that you're trying to export, because if it is a complex product and they don't understand it, you will get stuck, and you'll get stuck for a very long time, and the costs are extortionate.
Thank you, Leanne. Over to the other side of it, Andrew.
I think, again, still building on, and we didn't rehearse these answers, I promise. At the start of kind of Brexit journey, we kind of all saw customs agents popping up all over the place. And for a time, absolutely, these worked. They kept goods moving. And I think at the time they were a necessary evil. Although as the correct processes started to be implemented by both the UK and EU authorities, the only ones that have really kind of stood the test of time and that have really helped their customers avoid things like fines and delays are the ones that have the capacity to keep up with all of the changes and remain compliant. It's not always the case, but it does seem to have sort of favoured the larger scale brokers and hauliers and logistics companies, and that's ultimately the direction I'd send anyone.
Thank you both. We have time for a couple more questions. So we've actually got a few questions in on the EU-UK deal. I expect these will be quite short answers. So first, we've got a question from James. Do you have an estimation of the timeline of how soon those changes, so under the UK EU deals, would take place if the agreement is ratified? Joe, do you have anything you can give James here?
I wish I had a crystal ball in front of me, but alas, that's not the case. Realistically, it's not going to be before 2026. What we've seen this week is the proposed policy. So everyone will need to go away and work out all of the finities of this deal. So it can and will change over time. Devil's in the detail, but we don't have any detail yet. So we've got the promise at the moment, but it does take a significant amount of time to negotiate these things. And realistically, if I was a gambling man, I'd say middle of 26 is somewhat likely, but you can't hold me to account for that because I honestly cannot predict the future. I am not Nostradamus.
Thanks, Joe. So that's very James, that's very much how long's a piece of string. The daily update will cover it as it comes out. These things usually take a while because this entire parliamentary process to go through. Like Joe says, we don't know. We think 2026 at some point. A similar one from Dimitri, just on the detail. Again, this might be a short answer. Are you aware of whether high-risk food of non-animal origin goods would also be included in the reduction of checks and certification requirements under the SPS zone?
This is an interesting one because within the policy, it noted that processed products with 30% physical checks and 100% documentary checks would not require any export paperwork anymore. Now, that would refer to medium risk goods. So high risk goods would be 100% physical checks and 100% documentary checks. So from what I could see from the outline of that policy detail, I would expect high-risk foods, where it's listed as high risk, to actually have some remaining export documentation needed. But again, until we get more details, I can't say any further.
Thank you, Joe. One last question before I wrap things up from Stuart. I think this might get a few war stories coming out now. Are products rejected often because of paperwork?
I can jump in on this one, and certainly in France, I can see it depends. It really sometimes depends on the vet that's on at the time. Certainly, when importing, everyone would have heard the pragmatic approach into the UK, and you will quite often get that case within France as well. When they kind of started off introducing their own checks, they were extremely to the point, and everything had to be absolutely right. But you are now seeing a little bit of leeway depending on the vet. It is still a regular occurrence for larger issues. Sometimes goods are rejected for a simple date being wrong on a signature. Sometimes they are accepted. You know, it's human error. It does happen. It is a weekly occurrence, but I will also stress that we move a lot of products of animal origin loads through, so maybe our numbers are a little bit skewed.
Thank you, Andrew. So we're almost at the hour mark. So first, I'd like to thank Joseph, Andrew, and Leanne for their expertise they've shared with us. We're just going to have a quick 1-minute video to be shared with you. That should be coming online now, just about some of our work with SPS goods.
It was actually an import in our very early days that brought me to the Institute's helpline. We had an order from a customer and they'd ordered raspberries, which was nothing untoward and nothing out of the ordinary. However, when it got picked up by the forwarder, the agent sort of got in touch with the exporter and said, these raspberries originate from Ukraine. And we thought, well, why is that a problem? And of course, you know, the conflict had gone on. The EU and the UK had passed a lot of very fast legislation to say that purchasing from Ukraine came with some needs to verify that the goods had not been purchased from Russian-controlled parts. Now, I say that with hindsight because I now know the answer. But when the freight forwarder, my exporter, got in touch and said they're not letting us move the goods because the raspberries are from Ukraine, that was all the information I had. So I'm sat there Googling, and then I just suddenly thought, well, why don't I give the Institute a call? 2-3 hours later, I've spoken to the helpline, they've called me back, and lo and behold, I just needed to pass back the information to my exporter that they needed to amend their invoice with an exporter's declaration saying that, you know, they had purchased this from non-Russian controlled territories. That one incident was so worthwhile. You know, within 6 hours of having a problem that I had no idea how to solve, I'd realised that the problem wasn't huge, it was minor. We'd had alterations made and there was no hold up whatsoever, and the delivery wasn't late. So in terms of my whole experience using the helpline, you know, I couldn't recommend it enough.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. On the final slide, I'd like to take the last opportunity to talk about membership. If you've liked what we've seen so far and what you've heard, why not join us for more expert insight into the world of trade? It's a great place to build skilled, knowledgeable teams, connect with our experts and industry professionals like Joe here, and grow your food and drink exports. You can find more on the link there, or there should be a link in the chat. A final reminder, we do have a survey afterwards. Do fill that out. We do appreciate your feedback. Otherwise, thank you all for joining us. I'll give special thanks again to Joe, Andrew, and Leanne. We really appreciate having them with us today. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I hope you have a good rest of the day. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.